Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us again for episode 3 of Nutrition Unpacked. We are really excited here. With my co host, Brenda Davis, and our beautiful guest, Matthew Nagra. Hey, hello, everybody. How are you doing today?
I'm doing all right. How about you guys?
Awesome. So, today we're going to talk about another big myth online, which is that, um, well, seed oils are toxic and they're poisoning us and killing us and giving us all the diseases that we are plagued by in today's society. And Dr. Nagra, you are really a big expert about the subject because it's been going around for so long, and you made a point of taking the science to the public so that people stop being confused. Unfortunately, the ones that are confusing are still sharing the same misinformation, and we really care to demystify this concept that the bad guys are the oils. And I see this even in the space of hormonal health. I specialize in hormonal health, and when I see gynecologists or doctors that talk to women about how we have to stay away from these oils because they're creating all our hormonal problems, that to me is such a big concern. So it's just fear mongering, and we're already confused and overwhelmed, especially when we're going through our transitions between perimenopause and postmenopause. The last thing we need is to stress about seed oil. And it goes for everybody else, whether it's a heart disease or obesity or diabetes. So thank you so much for joining us today.
No problem. And yeah, this is a topic I've made a lot of content on and have actually a really big paper coming out on soon. So I'll
Ooh,
definitely share that around when it's out.
amazing. Please
Oh,
tell.
that's exciting. That's very exciting, Matt. So, when is your paper coming out?
So I have the proofs for it, so it should be really
Okay.
soon. It was with Mark Messina, who I know you know.
Oh, yes.
I'm the lead author, he's the senior author, and then we also worked with David Goldman and Martha Billery, who's sort of an expert in a lot of the sort of fatty acid metabolism stuff as well. So yeah, it's massive. It's like 40,000 words.
Oh, wow.
It's
Wow.
it's in
Well,
the
Matt,
critical
I'm
reviews.
I'm so excited about the papers that you're putting out because your topics are always spot on, and this one is so needed. And it's exciting to hear that you worked with Mark Messina because he has a lot of wonderful insights, and the other authors. It's just I'm excited to see it.
Yeah, I'm excited to finally get it out. It's been so many months because it started as like, hey, let's talk about a lot of the heart disease stuff, and then we'd a lot of these topics that we write about, David and I in particular, they come from things that we hear on social media. We hear from family and friends, so they're pretty topical. And then we'd sort of gone down rabbit holes of listening to podcasts and stuff about seed oils, and then we're like, oh, they said this. Now we have to add that to the paper. Like it just kept building and building and building. So we kind of
Wow.
want it to be like a one-stop shop that just really addresses all of the major concerns.
Wow.
Perfect. I love that. Okay, well, then we can start with the biggest claim, and this is verbatim. It's seed oils are poisonous and toxic. And Paul Saladino appears on Fed Ally documentary, and this is exactly what he said about them, that they cause obesity and chronic disease, and that we really need to avoid them at all costs. So can we just
Yeah, I
maybe
mean,
talk about what seed oils are for people that maybe have lived under a rock and
yeah,
you
so seed oils are, well, as the name implies, they're oils extracted from seeds. But the thing is, not all oils extracted from seeds kind of get lumped into that category of seed oils because there's that aspect. But then usually they're referring to specifically the oils that are high in the omega-6 fatty acid called linoleic acid. These would be oils like soybean oil, cottonseed oil, sunflower, safflower, corn oil. Those are some of the big ones. And then you can also throw canola oil in there, although it's a bit lower in that omega-6 fat and a bit higher in monounsaturated fats and the omega-3 fat, alpha-linolenic acid. That aside, the reason that other oils like flaxseed oil, even sesame oil don't really get lumped in that much is because again the fatty acid composition is a bit different, but also they tend to be really rich in like antioxidant content and other things that make them maybe a little bit different than the other class of these seed oils that I mentioned.
Hmm, perfect. And so Can you maybe clarify for people again what is the difference between an omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acid?
Yeah, it's just where there's a double bond in the chemical structure. So if it's basically three spots from the end, it's an omega-3. If it's six spots from the end, or if the first one is six spots from the end, then it's the omega-6. And these are, what's also important is linoleic acid and alpha linolenic acid are both essential fatty acids. So that's sort of one of the reasons it's a bit weird that they get so demonized, or at least the omega-6s get so demonized, is like we need them. We need at least a certain amount. Now, it's very easy to surpass that in today's day and age with the sort of dietary patterns that people are consuming, especially when you're consuming a lot of, say, ultra processed foods that tend to have a lot of added oils. Then you are certainly getting a lot that way. But let's not forget they are essential. We need some in our diet for sure.
Exactly, good point. I don't know if Brenda, you want to add anything to this?
I think Matt covered it very, very well, but I think it is really important that people do recognize that there are only two essential fatty acids. One is an omega-6 linoleic acid, and one is an omega-3 alpha linolenic acid. Those aren't optional. We have to have them for our survival as human beings.
Good. Actually, can I just go a little bit off script about the seed oil? About just to ask, I've seen a lot of people online sharing now having supplements that contain omega-7 and omega-9, which are not essential. What's your opinion on that? Should we even take supplements for these things, or should it be because they're not essential? Don't we not need to take them in food?
Well, non-essential nutrients can still have some benefits. Like I would say creatine is a great example of one that if you're looking to boost athletic performance, strength in particular, there are reasons to take higher doses than you would get through food sources, if you're even having food sources of creatine. But that said, I haven't seen any good like human data suggesting benefits from those particular fat supplements.
Mm.
So I don't know that there's a really strong reason to take them. But I wouldn't say just because something's not essential that we shouldn't consider taking it.
Okay. Thank you so much
And
for that.
I would agree, and I think that in terms of these supplements of fats, the amount of fat people eat in the North American diet, and including omega-7s and nines, is so high. There's absolutely no need to be taking those non-essential fats. If you're going to be taking any fats, to me, it would be as a person who is a non-consumer of fish and wants some long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, which is the more biologically active form of omega-3s, EPA and DHA specifically. But beyond that, I don't see a big reason to be taking fatty acid supplements.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, the next one that I see a lot online is from Dr. Eric Berg. He has a big following on YouTube, a big channel, and he also lumps seed oils as harmful because they are industrially processed. Therefore, they oxidize easily and drive up inflammation. So what is your take on this?
Okay, so there's like three claims there. The first claim that they're industrially processed, like, for one, they don't have to be, they just tend to be. But even when they are, um, I think the processing is very misunderstood. For one, just because something's processed doesn't necessarily make it harmful. There are lots of things like whole grain breads and cereals that can be processed and can be healthy. And then there's things like sodas that are processed and not so healthy. And so we have to kind of look at where on that spectrum do they lie. Now, the main parts of the processing, at least as far as I am aware, and maybe if you've heard something else, let me know, that I think get the most flack are one, the usage of solvents to extract the oils. And then two is the bleaching process, mostly because of the name of that process or what is typically called. So when it comes to solvent extraction, they'll often, but not always, use solvents that contain hexane. And that's because the fats can dissolve in this solvent and get pulled out of whatever seed, meal, or whatever you're extracting it from. But then the hexane can evaporate at a low temperature. So this way you don't actually have to heat the oil very high. You just modestly heat it, the hexane evaporates away, and you're left with either zero or very low trace amounts that would be essentially zero. Now, some people still raise concerns about those trace amounts. However, the amounts are well below limits that we have, like here in Canada and other parts of the world, where you'd have to consume an absurd amount to get anywhere near that sort of limit. If we look at I believe it's called the Institute of something for harmonization. I'm blanking on the name, but it's in our paper. But basically, there's a safety limit of daily exposure, 2.9 milligrams a day of hexane. You would have to consume nearly 5 kilograms of oils using the typical hexane content per day every day to reach that sort of limit. Okay, 5 kilograms. Now let's compare that to if you take the 90th percentile fat intake in the US, it's about 112 grams a day. Okay, so you're talking almost 50, over 40 times the most fat that Americans consume daily, or nearly the most fat that Americans consume daily, but every day. It's just not possible. And so that's why I just think it's not, it's a really a non-issue. And again, a lot of these oils test completely negative for hexane as well. I'm just using numbers from ones that might contain a trace amount. Um, so that's one part of the processing. Now, the second part, and I made a video on this recently, is the bleaching. When people hear bleaching, they think you're pouring Clorox into your oil. And that's not what's happening here. This is like how flowers are bleached and stuff like that as well. They use what are called bleaching clays. So these are like natural bleaching clays from mineral deposits like bentonite, for example. And basically, they'll mix this with the oil, again, modestly heat it, and they actually absorb the colored pigments and some other impurities, potentially in the oils, and then you just filter them out. And so all it is that's what bleaching is. It's color removal. And so these bleaching clays just absorb those colored pigments, you filter it out, and it makes for a cleaner product. It's actually a good thing. And that's also something that's misunderstood, is that these processes that it go through are for a reason, to make actually a product a cleaner, healthier, safer product. But for some reason they get villainized for that reason. So before I jump into like inflammation and stuff, just if there's any other like questions about the processing or comments on that, let me know.
I do have a comment. So the funny part about this is that the people that will share this being such a terrible thing for the food and that it can poison us are also people that would do a lot of detoxes and actually use bentonite clay. So to me, almost like warrants the fact that these anchors that they use online are on purpose for getting, following and fearmonger to get the public to really follow them as their savior rather than actually saying the truth, because I'm sure that they know the difference between using actual bleach and bentonite clay, which they, as I said, would use in a protocol that they sell to then detoxify the body. So it that is really my only comment. Like I've seen this and I'm like, why would you, be double standards here, right?
Yep, I think you're right, and I think like some may be intentionally doing it like that, and I think honestly for some people they've just never looked into it themselves.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny, a lot of these individuals they have sort of propped themselves up as maybe an authority on this topic. However, they've sort of positioned that, yet they haven't done a 5-second Google search on like what the processing of seed oils is. Like that's like the kind of the big concern here. Actually, the particular video I made on the bleaching was a guy saying, "Hey, let's see how we make seed oils at home," and just trying to make it look scary. And he's literally pouring bleach into the oil, and I think that they actually believe that. Like I don't think it's a matter of they're trying to pull one over. I think it's just truly what they believe because they haven't actually investigated it.
Yeah, that's even, I don't know if it's scarier, but definitely scary.
Yeah.
Well, I think the scariest thing is that individuals that do that kind of thing can have the power they do to influence how people make food choices. And that's to me the scariest part, that people become so ill-informed that they start making choices that can hurt them.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
and
true.
let's be clear. I don't think anyone needs to consume seed oils. I don't think anybody needs to consume olive oil either, or any oils. I think you can get these essential fats from things like nuts and seeds and avocado. I mean, avocado maybe not so much the essential fats, but like healthy fats regardless. You can get them from a lot of these other sources. The big problem to me is when you're fear mongering over seed oils and then you're going to butter and tallow and these high saturated fat options. I think that's where there's the bigger problem. And I guess that kind of brings us maybe into the inflammation topic a little bit, where people will often suggest choosing those oils instead because they're low in this omega-6 linoleic acid. Well, the idea that the seed oils or that consuming high amounts of linoleic acid is inflammatory comes from the fact that, in theory, linoleic acid could be converted into another fatty acid called arachidonic acid, and that fatty acid could potentially be inflammatory. But there's several layers of problems with this. For one, arachidonic acid isn't always inflammatory. It can be, or it may actually be anti-inflammatory, depending on where it is and what's going on in the body. So that's issue number one. The second issue is we actually have tracer studies where you look at how much of the linoleic acid you consume is converted into arachidonic acid, and it's anywhere between 0.12 to 0.26%. It's less than a percent, way under a percent. It basically doesn't happen. And then we have studies where they've actually fed them to humans and measured the levels of arachidonic acid in their bodies before and after. And by reducing linoleic acid intake by up to 90%, it makes basically zero difference in the arachidonic acid levels in your body. It does nothing. And so that's like the whole pathway just doesn't make sense, or it doesn't pan out when you test the arachidonic acid levels. And then finally, we have trials. We have tons of them, and we actually made a whole table in our paper going through every trial, at least up until a certain date, on this topic. And there are just no studies showing that seed oils increase markers of inflammation when traditionally prepared. So, I mean, there are maybe one or two studies where they do some really extreme things to the oil. Like there was one where they put the oil through 20 repeated like heating and cooling cycles over 2 days, and then they had people consume them. And then there was a temporary bump in some inflammatory markers. There was another one where they heated them, I think it was like 60 degrees above typical deep frying temperatures. So it was like 250 degrees or 240 degrees or something, Celsius, for Americans listening. And they did that for like an hour straight and then had some people consume it. And there was like a temporary bump in certain inflammatory markers for like an hour or two. But like these are very extreme edge cases, and that's not how anybody would recommend using these oils. Even under standard heating practices, standard frying, standard baking, we don't see anything. And so, these arguments, like we have to test them. That's the whole thing. Is that we have to actually test: does this hypothesis, does this theory work out? And it turns out that they don't.
Imagine
Yeah,
this.
and I would just add that I think, not only do they not increase we think about inflammatory markers like CRP and IL-6 and, TNF alpha, those kinds of things, they don't increase those markers, but also they're actually associated with lower cardiovascular risk, which is the hard endpoint that we're worried about.
Yeah. Yeah. So actually, I talk about this in the paper too. I go through all the studies or the main studies anyway, that people will cite to suggest harm for heart health. And then some of the better studies, and we look at, comparison, which ones provide the most value. But at the end of the day, yeah, we should always be looking at hard endpoints if we have the data. Obviously, if we don't have the data, we have to make assumptions. But we do have data on long-term health, like heart disease, type 2 diabetes risk, cancer risk, et cetera. And the specific example I always raise is exercise. So exercise actually raises inflammatory markers. It can last for a couple days. Yet exercise is really good for you. It lowers your heart disease risk at the end of the day. Exercise also impairs endothelial function. It can also raise your blood sugar. It certainly raises your blood pressure. Yet exercise is one of the most universally accepted beneficial things that you can do for your health. And that just really highlights the point that we can't focus in on these temporary temporary changes in intermediate markers. We have to look at the end of the day, what is the net effect? Because there are hundreds to thousands of different mechanisms taking place at one time, and almost certainly you can pick out one that is harmful. Just like with smoking, you can actually pick out some mechanisms that are beneficial with smoking. Appetite suppression, for example, there are some benefits with certain receptors that nicotine binds to in the brain, and like we can just go down that rabbit hole all day, but the net effect is really bad, and so you shouldn't be smoking, So and this is something that a lot of these influencers online, I think, really take advantage of, is they'll find some type of mechanism that they can build a narrative around, and then they end up scaring people away from making healthier choices.
True. You mentioned something, if I can just piggyback on the IRA.
Yep.
So, arachidonic acid, I heard somebody, Dr. Ely, was sharing this a while back that it cannot, in his opinion, and I don't know if he had a study that showed this at all, so forgive me if I don't have a study. Um, he said that arachidonic acid can be inflammatory in the presence of saturated fats, which by definition would mean with animal products, but it's not so with non unsaturated fats. Have you come across this information, or it's just really not not proven?
I mean, I haven't, I'm not sure if that is like clearly demonstrated or not. What I can point out is that actually one of the studies we went over looking at inflammation in our paper found that if you replace butter with one of the seed oils, I can't remember which specific one, there was actually again, this was short term, it was a single meal, but for a period of a couple hours or so, lower inflammatory markers with the seed oil compared to the butter. And
Mm.
so, again, a little bit ironic, the sort of claims that are made around it, but I'm not sure if that's because it has anything to do with the metabolism of arachidonic acid or anything. So I can't really speak to that with confidence, but at least, again, looking at the whole food, we saw this short-term bump, but I wouldn't put a lot of stock in it. Like that's why I haven't mentioned it yet, right? I'm not going to say, hey, this one study showed this, therefore, this temporary change is super meaningful. I don't think that's super meaningful either way. Um, because at the end of the day, we know that replacing butter with seed oils lowers your heart disease risk, and that's the important part.
True. And you also mentioned standard cooking practices. And I think people maybe are getting confused that standard cooking practices are where you use at home, you would use the oil once, then you discard it, versus obviously going to a chain of fast food where they reheat the oil over and over again. So those two are very different. And of course, I've seen even, we have seen, even with the guidelines in the US that came out, that using the narrative of the seed oil being bad and therefore they should change seed oil for tallow in McDonald's, for example, just to name a chain, would make it healthier. And I think this is actually a very dangerous claim, especially coming from government bodies or at least representatives of. How can we educate people to make sure that they understand the difference and also they don't go and follow a narrative which eventually can get them into trouble?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, if you're consuming a ton of food from McDonald's or Steak and Shake or whatever place that he went was, I'd say that's just not going to be great for you from a standpoint of probably really high sodium, probably very hyper palatable, calorie dense, etc. There's going to be a lot of problems with that consuming it regularly. That the fat source is one of the smaller issues there. Now. One thing that we tried to identify, and it doesn't look like there is a clear answer for this, is like what are standard cooking practices in a fast food restaurant, as far as the use of oil and how often they discard it. And it doesn't seem that there's clear guidance around that. It seems to be more like, hey, once it starts affecting the flavor and all of that, then that's sort of, they have a certain timeline at which they would discard it. But I think that that can be different between different places. So yeah, I mean, if you're cooking with the same oil all day, that could potentially lead to production of certain compounds that might have some downstream effect. It's all very speculative at this point because we just don't know precisely like what the result of that would be. But I would also say that using a high saturated fat, low polyunsaturated fat option is not necessarily going to be a safer option. For one, we know the saturated fats raise your blood lipids more. At the same time, saturated fat-rich foods aren't free of concern from excessive heating. So, for example, butter, if you heat it at high temperatures, it actually leads to more production of advanced glycation end products than seed oils do. It actually leads to more production of certain toxic compounds called, what are they, alpha decarbonyl compounds, I believe, that are carcinogenic in isolation. Again, in food sources, with how much, I'm not sure that they would be or wouldn't be, but certainly they lead to production of far more than if you were to consume seed oils. And so there are the sort of type of degradation in the compounds that are produced are just different depending on what your fat source is. It's not like there are none. And that's something else that gets left out. And these are things that I really tried to include in our paper because I don't want to just say, hey, here's what the science on seed oils is, but I want to showcase this is why it's problematic to point the blame at seed oils, but then not consider these issues with other sources that you might choose. And so, yeah, I'm hoping that that comes across clearly once it's out there.
Mm-hmm. Brenda, anything to add?
No, I think that was beautifully said.
Perfect. And this is something that we kind of spoke about in the last episode with Dr. Carvalho about especially heart disease, because he really, really dives deep into LDL and ApoB. And yet we have, again, the proponents of especially the carnivore lifestyle that will say that seed oils are the ones causing heart disease, as we mentioned just now. But they also, almost make it sound like it's bad to lower LDL cholesterol for heart disease. Therefore, they think and say that replacing, when replacing oils, seed oils with butter, ghee, tallow, lard, they raising LDL and ApoB is actually good for cardiovascular health, which is the opposite of what we know from science. Can you explain why there's this no, I don't even think I can call it confusion at this point. It's like totally opposite narrative.
I think it's what we call like a post hoc justification. I think basically they've chosen some sort of dietary lifestyle or yeah, a dietary pattern that they like, that they want to promote. It could be because they just enjoy it. It could be for political reasons. It could be, I mean, there's endless reasons. I don't want to speculate about people's reasons for choosing that, but they've chosen something that they want to continue doing, and then they have to sort of backwards justify it. And one of the things that is very clear, and there's no getting around this, like you can find people who say go carnivore and improve their blood glucose levels. You can find people that go carnivore and lose a bunch of weight, and maybe their blood pressure improves as well. You are not going to find many people that go carnivore and drop their LDL. In fact, in most cases, it's going to go up, and it's going to go up a lot. And so they need some way to justify having this additional risk factor. And so they'll find all sorts of ways to explain it. Like they'll say, oh, well, our body produces cholesterol. If our body produces it, why could it be bad? Well, our body also produces inflammatory markers. Our body also produces blood glucose if you don't consume any glucose. Like carnivores who, let's say they don't even consume dairy, they have no sugar in their diet, they still have glucose in their blood because their body is producing it. You can um, that's just like I don't know how else to explain it other than it's that backwards justification, and I think it's one of the more harmful things that is out there. It's something that I see in my practice a lot. Um, you see a lot of people. Actually, there was this keto CTA study that came out that was kind of used to justify these really high LDL levels in some people, and it just got retracted. And they say they're going to publish new results or something, but I don't know how else to sort of break that down, but that's sort of my thoughts on it.
Do we need to worry about the public, about when they just think that seed oil are going to kill them and they switch to animal products, or even a heavy amount of coconut oil, because it's still saturated fats?
Yeah, I think people making that, I think we do have to worry about people making those choices. Um, I guess the one uh, glimmer of hope is that I don't know if, say, what we see on social media necessarily reflects the masses. I think if you were to go out and, say, poll people on the street about like their thoughts on a carnivore diet, I think a lot of, and again, this is just speculative, I think a lot of people are either not going to know what that is or think it's crazy. And so that's like the one little bit of hope that I have, but it's still affecting enough people. We're seeing these ideas platformed on like the Joe Rogan podcast and stuff like that where it's getting out to a lot of people. So yeah, it's concerning in a way for sure. But I also think it's passing a little bit. You see people who really promoted the carnivore diet, like Paul Saladino, is no longer carnivore, and he openly admits that he ran into health issues on the very diet he popularized. He's probably the one person most responsible with popularizing the carnivore diet, yet he abandoned it. And now he says he eats mostly fruit, which is, I think, kind of funny. Um, and so, yeah, I'm hoping that we, turn the page here, but we'll see, I guess, in the next few years.
Mm-hmm. Do we, I guess the other question is, especially because you have a practice, so you see real life patients as well. And Brenda, you see a lot of people coming to your talks, and reaching out after you publish every book. So I just wonder if the the public, with the confusion they have, they they sometimes, because I've seen a lot of people that were on a plant-based diet before and then they start switching over to different lifestyle because they feel like actually a plant-based diet is just not complete enough, is not allowing them to be healthy, and they'd rather, however, take out the very things that we know from science are healthy, like fiber, for example. How aside from the seed oil issue, when it comes to these kinds of foods, how do we make sure people understand that there is a person, like there is the social media aspect of things where everything is kind of general and for everybody, and it's mainstream and glamorous, or just for everyone, no point, like you're not special. But then there is that element of when we work with our patients, that it's, you're a unique human being going through this experience, and we need to really just modify things for you because your health is different to another person. So how do we talk to people that are perhaps switching from having a whole food plant-based diet, or just vegan diet, and you maybe can say what the difference is between the two, even when it comes to health, and then switching on to like something that is very high in these kinds of fats, and like tallow and lard, and abandoning the seed oils behind, and every other thing with that too, including the fiber.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the foundations of a healthy diet are very clear and consistent across populations, across ethnic backgrounds, et cetera. However, as you noted, some people might just feel better eating lower carbohydrate or higher carbohydrate. Some people who are competitive athletes might need to focus even more so on upping their protein. I know Brenda and I both aim for a little bit higher than, say, the general recommendations, but for like a competitive athlete, they might go even another 30% higher than that. And so there are certainly these individualizations that can occur. And then somebody with, say, Crohn's disease might have to modify their diet during a flare even further. There are reasons to do that. What we don't see, and I haven't seen any good evidence of across the literature, is completely flipping dietary guidance on its head. I just haven't seen that anywhere where, okay, all of a sudden now, because of your genetic makeup or something, you need to completely avoid fiber-rich foods. You need to double down on saturated fats, especially red meats and things like this. We just don't see that. We're all similar enough that the foundations remain relatively consistent. And then you make little tweaks around the edges typically. But I don't know if Brenda has any other, commentary there.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I think that we have basic requirements, and I don't think there are certain groups of people that are going to do well on a carnivore diet, and certain people that are going to do well on a plant-based diet. I think we all do well on a diet that is rich in whole foods, or minimally processed foods, where plants predominate, and within that. Certainly, there can be different amounts of animal products, and people can still do reasonably well. So, we can do very well on a plant exclusive diet. But if you look at the healthiest populations in the world, most of them include some animal products and also do relatively well. The key is that we're eating largely plant foods, and we're eating largely unprocessed or minimally processed foods. And even within that, though, I think it's really important to mention that when we think about ultra processed foods and we use the NOVA classification, there are foods within NOVA classification 4 that actually are beneficial to health. Things like, I think of, you think of a fortified, unsweetened soy milk, for example, which can add valuable calcium and vitamin D and B12 to the diet of a person eating a plant-based diet like Matt and I do. And so I think there is nuance within even that system. So that we need to recognize. But
Yeah,
generally, yeah.
yeah, and one of the examples that I bring up too, well, I bring up like whole grain breakfast cereals and that because they tend to do really well in the research. But also, if you want to take a completely unprocessed food, or unprocessed in the ways typically described. I think we can talk about some processes involved,
Mm-hmm.
but like red meat, and then we take Beyond Meat. I mean, we have the swap meat trial, where
Mhm.
you even take this ultra processed plant-based burger. I would say a less healthy version than what's now available because they've reformulated, and you compare that to the meats. In that swap meat trial and in other trials that have been done since, you actually see improvements in cardiometabolic risk factors, improvements in LDL cholesterol, a little bit of weight loss as well. And so there are examples where you can take an ultra processed food and see it perform better than even an unprocessed food.
Yes, and I think the other point to make is the NOVA classification isn't perfect. It doesn't factor in nutrition. It's just degree of processing of the food, and
Mhm.
you can't make a judgment on a food where you're not factoring in the nutritional value it provides. And the other thing that I'm definitely not an expert on, but I can't help but think, in group one, we've got things like fruits and vegetables and whole, intact or whole grains and legumes and things like that. But we've also got meat, poultry, fish, dairy, many dairy products. And I'm not thoroughly convinced that those foods should be considered absolutely unprocessed because when you think about what we're feeding the animals, a lot of the food they're being fed is highly processed. And the way that they're prepared is sometimes quite processed. I mean, we add a lot of things to milk, for example. Lots of nutrients are added there, so they're not completely unprocessed. So I don't know. There's a lot of things that we don't always consider when we look at those classifications.
I
Yep.
agree. And I think actually one point of that is also that these, especially when the meat people consume, the milk, the eggs, they come from cattle operations. They're not even fed their species appropriate diets. So, you know, it's I know that there are a lot of people out there saying game meat is better because it's lower in omega-6 fatty acids, and it's higher in omega-3s in comparison to cattle. But like, if you have to be realistic, it's very expensive to buy certain meats, aside from our ethical perspective of it as vegans. But, you know, how many people don't eat that? People will eat the cow operation meat, and you can tell them until the cows come home that it's not a good idea. But the point is that it's the reality of people's finances. Like, they're not going to be able to afford non-cow meat, and so that is never taken into consideration when we talk about processing of the animal products, and we highly demonize the processing of plants, you know. um
Yep.
I think there is something else about the, maybe we can clarify this actually, about the processed foods, because I think this will come up in many episodes that we will have in future too. But processing food, as Brenda just said, it is not perfect. Like the NOVA classification, which is currently used, would sometimes get it right about, hyper processed food versus just processed food. And sometimes you have to process the food in order to have it. Like even oats, you can't, like, the growth has to come from the plant. If you don't process it, you're not going to eat it. But what do people have to look for when it comes to processed foods?
I think it's the nutritional composition more than anything. So looking at the saturated fat content, looking at the sodium content, looking at the fiber content. So that's actually one of the negatives of a lot of the processing, is that a bunch of the fiber is typically removed. Not always, but in most cases. Those are the sorts of things I would look out for. And then one of the benefits of processing, I would look at micronutrient content, because in a lot of cases, if things are fortified, you're actually going to have a really high, say, calcium content in plant-based milks. A lot of cereals have added iron, which is great. And so those are the types of things I would focus much more on rather than, looking at the ingredients list. I think for the layperson can be really confusing and a bit frightening in some cases. I get this a lot with my patients where they'll be like, oh, but what about that long list of ingredients on the soy milk? And I'll go through it with them, and there's like three ingredients plus like 10 nutrients. Right? And so they're adding things it'll say ergocalciferol, which is just vitamin D. It'll say cyanocobalamin, which is just vitamin B12. But it sounds a lot more freaky than it really is.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'd look more at the nutrition facts label.
That's smart. I like
Yeah,
that.
and I couldn't agree more. And I think that the bottom line is we want a high quality diet. And so we need to look at food quality. And when an ultra processed food or a highly processed food provides no nutritional value, it's sugar and the cheapest sugar, cheapest fat, cheapest, add sodium and a bunch of preservatives. It's not something that's going to add value to the human diet. It's a low quality food. On the other hand, we might have a what we think of as a hyper processed food like a veggie meat or a veggie or a plant-based milk that actually has fairly few ingredients. There's some nutrients added, but they're providing tremendous value, especially for plant-based eaters who may fall a little bit short on calcium or B12 or even protein for that matter. And so it ends up to me being a quality food because it's adding value to the total diet.
That is true. And when it comes, I heard Dr. Mindy Peltz actually talking about um, detoxifying from seed oils because they're bad for our liver. I think, can we just maybe clarify that
Yeah.
part?
So I have a whole section in this upcoming paper on liver fat. And actually David Goldman wrote most of that, so I'll give him credit. Um, we actually have studies directly comparing seed oils to other fats or carbohydrates. And in the context of overfeeding, so if you're eating in excess, which a lot of people do, but if you're eating in excess, and you're choosing seed oils instead of, say, butter or even instead of refined carbohydrates, you can actually lower your liver fat relative to those other sources. However, if you're eating in calorie balance, so you're at a healthy weight, you're not gaining body fat either, it doesn't seem to really matter because the weight gain is the primary driver. But if you are gaining weight and you're consuming more seed oils, it's actually better for your liver than if you're consuming more of the saturated fats. So that's a really important takeaway. So it's just completely inaccurate to say that it's damaging our liver.
And we don't have to detox from them.
Yes, absolutely not.
Brilliant. So you obviously have looked at many papers to put this paper that you wrote. So it's more
Mhm.
like a meta-analysis of the claims made online. And I just feel like because there are a lot of papers out there, and I also seen you do some debates on Simon Hill's podcast with other doctors that are against seed oils, and somehow they have an argument that they will stand by. What is the actual evidence, the papers, the research that these carnivores or not carnivores or just these doctors that really hate seed oils will stand by and maybe are not looking at when it comes to the evidence that supports that seed oil can be beneficial for us?
Yeah, so there's some of it we've already covered, but there's especially with heart health because that's where we have most of the research. There are three main studies that they'll reference. The first is the Minnesota coronary experiment. So this was done in the late 60s, early 70s. And this was in a mental institution, and they had over 9,000 people initially. And they randomized them to having corn oil and corn oil margarine as the seed oil group, or a more standard diet at the time, rich in animal fats. Now, there was no significant difference in mortality between groups, and but there was a higher risk of heart attack in the seed oil group in their sort of follow-up analysis that was done decades later. They followed people initially for a few years, but they sort of recovered data many decades later and then reanalyzed it. And so people will really cling to that finding, but there's a few issues with this. For one, in that study, what they often ignore is that three-quarters of people dropped out by 1 year.
Mm.
Okay, a ridiculous dropout rate. And this is because at the time, there was a transition to outpatient treatment for people who were living in these sorts of institutions. So people were being discharged from treatment. At the same time, even while they were there, they were allowed to go in and out. So they could have been eating meals outside of the institution as well. So that was a problem. And then even for people who remained on the diet past a year, they didn't remain long enough to do their proper analysis that they had planned on. So there's some issues. Second, with the heart attack finding, that is based on recovery of only half of the autopsy reports. They didn't actually recover all the reports, and so we have to exercise a lot of caution around, okay, was it actually a high risk of heart attack, or did we just get certain subset of the results? Who knows? And so that's another problem. And then the other claim that they'll make is that, well, for every 30 milligram per deciliter drop in cholesterol levels in the study, there was a 22% higher risk of mortality. And they will use that to say, well, clearly the people who were consuming more seed oils and lowering their cholesterol more were doing worse. Again, there's a problem with that in that we saw that trend in both groups, the seed oil group and the non-seed oil group. So why was the non-seed oil group having the same result? What likely explains it is that as we get older and sicker, whether that's due to cancers or infections or what have you, cholesterol levels drop. So there could be something that is killing people and lowering their cholesterol, but it's not the seed oils that are killing people. Um, so there's so many problems. And then finally, the seed oil at the time, the corn oil margarine, was likely rich in trans fats because of what was available at the time, and that's not accounted for. Now, I will grant that we actually don't know what types of margarines or shortenings might have been consumed in the other group because while they were having a lot of saturated fats, they may have still been having some common margarines and stuff. So it's possible that they were also having trans fats. We don't really know. But that's another reason to cast doubt on the results is that we don't actually have good data on their dietary intake. So that's study one. Now the second study is the Sydney Diet Heart study. This one had less people, 450 some odd people. Actually, no, it might have been 800 something and then split in half, randomized. I'd have to double check the number. But they were randomized to either safflower oil and safflower oil margarine being the seed oil group, or again, a standard diet. And there was a higher risk of mortality, of cardiovascular disease mortality, coronary heart disease mortality in the seed oil group. But again, we know for sure, or with almost for sure, very high degree of certainty because we know the specific brand they use, the margarine was likely rich in trans fats. So that's problem one. And problem two is the participants in the diet, because this was after they had already had a heart attack that they were, or a cardiac event that they were enrolled, they made a lot of diet and lifestyle changes between when they had their event and when they were enrolled in the study and then throughout the study. And so there were actually a lot of moving parts, a lot of things changing that weren't properly accounted for. Now, later on, the researchers actually did an analysis where they looked at what variables might explain the difference in results. And guess what? Diet did not explain it. There were no dietary variables that explained the findings. What explained them best was pre-existing disease. So it appears that people who were worse off to begin with happen to be more likely to be randomized to the seed oil group. That can happen sometimes. It's not always perfect. And so it's likely that people who were put in that group already had worse disease to begin with, and so they're more likely to suffer an event during. This is also supported by the fact that over 40% of the deaths and cardiovascular events occurred within the first year of the trial. When you're talking about heart disease and diet change, it takes more than a year to really make a significant difference. And so that further supports that it was just people who were already on their way who happened to be put in that group. So there's a lot of issues with that one. And then the final one is the rose corn oil trial, where people were randomized to either olive oil, corn oil, or just standard diet. And in that case, there was no significant difference in events, in cardiac events between groups. But people will still cite it because there was a non-statistically significant increase, meaning it could be due to chance. We don't know. And just like the Sydney trial, over 40% of the events and the deaths occurred within the first, this time, 6 months, not even a year. So unlikely to be due to the dietary change as well. So these are very, very old, very flawed trials in many ways. Or I wouldn't even say the Rose trial is necessarily flawed. I think it just wasn't big enough. Like they just didn't have enough statistical power to really see what would happen. But there are clear issues. Now, if we look at the best trial on the topic, this is the LA Veterans Administration Hospital study. So this one included 800 some odd people. And they were randomized to either a cafeteria where foods were rich in animal fats, or a cafeteria where where the saturated animal fats were removed from these foods, and then they literally infused them with seed oil. So they would take even things like ice cream and remove the saturated fats and then infuse them with vegetable oils. So they did that with all the different foods. And they found that after 8 years, so this is a much longer trial than most of the others, after 8 years, there was about a 30% reduction in cardiovascular disease events in the seed oil group. And this is the one trial that stands up best to scrutiny. There are very few concerns with it. It is, in my opinion, one of the best dietary trials ever done. Like this was done in long-term care facilities. People were blinded. They didn't know which foods they were getting depending on where they were punching their meal tickets and all of that.
Yeah.
Um, they also did a small study prior where they had people consume the foods and made sure that they couldn't tell the difference between which ones were rich in the animal fats, which ones weren't, that they were acceptable. Like went really above and beyond. And it lines up with if you conduct a meta-analysis like the American Heart Association did in 2017 of the trials on this topic, it lines up very consistently or very clearly with the results that you get from the overall meta-analysis. And so I would say it is probably the single best trial, and then it's further supported by meta-analyses that have been done since then. And of course, supported by the long-term observational studies where you look at what people are consuming in the population. So that was very long-winded, but that I think hammers all the main points.
No, that was very good. And I think we need to talk about these because those are the ones that are used online to discredit
Yeah.
the benefits of seed oils or the non-harm of seed oils. If even if you don't believe that you, as you said, we don't have to have them. You can choose to have an oil-free, lifestyle and get your oils from whole foods, your fats from whole foods. That's okay. But there is a question that will come up a lot, and that
And
is
I would love to just add one thing
sure.
because it was just an excellent summary of the literature and the early studies. But I think that we need to remember that it's the totality of the evidence that really
Yeah.
matters. And they're quoting a few early studies. What has happened since? And what have the more rigorous trials like the LA Veterans trial shown? And then, we have to look at all of it. We can't just cherry pick a couple
Yeah.
of studies and expect that argument will be solid because it never will be.
Yeah.
Just a final point.
Yeah, and I'll even add that beyond the observational studies looking at consumption of these oils or those fats, we actually have studies measuring levels of linoleic acid in the body. So this is
Mm-hmm.
really compelling data because as we've highlighted, we don't make these fats. We have to consume them. They're essential. And so the more that you have in your body, it's likely to reflect a higher intake of those oils. In fact, we can look at the amount of the linoleic acid in our fat tissue, which better reflects longer term intake. And higher levels are associated with significantly lower risks of mortality. There's a meta-analysis by Lee et al. In 2020, I believe it was, that really highlighted this, and there have been a few other papers since, but it's very strong data at this point.
Yeah, and there is the last question I want to ask because I know we're running out of time. And also, this is one that will come up a lot. Obviously, we have olive oil that has a halo over its head, being, this is still an oil, it's a pure fat, and yet because of the high polyphenols that real olive oil have, is deemed to be different to other seed oils. Yet we know that we've done trials where, some seed oils can actually compared to olive oil in reducing inflammation. So why does olive oil have this halo and this great reputation versus seed oil having a bad one? And which seed oil, if people wanted to say, I'm going to consume this, is cheaper, which it is, versus consuming a fake olive oil, which is actually a thing too in supermarkets. What are the benefits? Like which one they should choose to actually be, getting the benefits too?
Yeah, I mean, as far as the health halo, why it has that, I'm not sure. I mean, it is consumed in Mediterranean countries, and obviously the Mediterranean diet's a very well researched, very healthy dietary pattern. And so there might be sort of like an association there that leads to it being viewed favorably. It also doesn't come with the baggage of a high omega-6 content, which is what a lot of the concerns are raised about. Obviously, they're not, real concerns, but they're things that are talked about. So I think that's largely why. But if we look at the long-term outcome data and we compare, say, olive oil to canola oil, we see comparable results.
Mm.
I would say those are the two that probably have the most research behind them. And actually, in randomized controlled trials, canola oil lowers LDL more than olive oil.
Wow.
Um, but what's interesting is that when we look at heart attack rates or actual heart disease risk, they're about the same. And so my suspicion there is that while canola oil, because of the high polyunsaturated fat content, lowers LDL a bit more, there might be other beneficial effects from some of those polyphenols in the olive oil, which sort of mitigates that difference. So, like at the end of the day, they're both fine. They're both great.
Mm-hmm.
Choose whichever one you like. But I would say canola oil just on the basis that it has the most research of the seed oils, or probably has the most research among the seed oils. But I also don't think you can go wrong with choosing soybean oil or corn oil or safflower or what have you. I think they're all fine. But those would be my picks.
Yeah.
And canola oil, it for some reason has such a bad rap, but it actually has probably the lowest or one of the lowest contents of saturated fat, probably about half of olive oil. And it's got more alpha linolenic acid or
Yeah.
omega-3 than other oils. It's a ratio of about 2 to 1 to 6 to 3. So it's in terms of fatty acid balance and essential fatty acids and saturated fat content, it gets a gold star.
Yeah.
So,
and I think maybe we have to, but we can end with the fact that none of us are saying to people you have to consume oil, but also I think people have to also be wise. Of course, if you eat a lot of junk and these seed oils are cheaper and therefore used, they don't get hard the temperature, like room temperature, so they are easy to work with. It's not the oil that is the problem, it's what else is in that package that you're having every day. So we're looking at your lifestyle, but also when you are, even if you have a good diet and you are using oil to cook and so on, again, don't just pour half of the bottle into your food. Like, be wise. Those are still, high calories. High calories means gaining weight, and that automatically is associated with many diseases that we see, like obesity and so on, from obesity and so on, like diabetes and cardiovascular disease. So, big picture, holistic picture is always the best, but knowing the facts about the food that we have, because we tend to demonize and then angelify other foods, and that kind of approach is very extreme. It also gets us into trouble.
Yeah,
So
I agree.
thank you so much to both. Dr. Nagra, we loved having you on. You're always a very good voice of reason, very clear and approachable, and also you know your stuff. We love that. So thank you for sharing. Thank you. Carry on doing your work on social media. It's really, really helpful. You probably see me commenting a lot. I just love it. I see a lot of things like I can't believe people say that. So thank you so much for making these great videos. And Brenda, of course, thank you so much for always sharing again your knowledge and wisdom, because we need people like you guys to be out there really clarifying a lot of the confusion.
and I just want to echo your sentiments to Dr. Nagra as well, because you are such a voice of reason, and we are so grateful you're part of our community. You've become an incredible leader, and yeah, just thank you for what you do.
Yeah,
Oh,
thank
well,
you.
thank you. Obviously, you're one of the first people I sort of met in the space. I think plantrition or something like that way back when. So definitely somebody I look up to.
Thank you. Bye, guys. And thank you, everybody, for listening to this podcast. As always, if you have questions or other myths we want us to bust, send them over. We are here for it.